Oxford Bookworms, Stage 1. The Coldest Place on Earth. Chapter 6. A Bad Start. On August 23rd, the Norwegian sledges were ready. They took them outside, and the dogs pulled them across the ice. The sun came up for half an hour, but it was too cold, minus 46 degrees centigrade. They could not travel in that weather. They went back to Framheim and waited. They waited 2 weeks, until September 8th. Then, with the temperature at minus 37 degrees centigrade, they started. They ran happily across the snow to the south. 8 men, 7 sledges, and 86 dogs. Only Lindström, the cook, stayed behind in Framheim. At first, everything went well. They went 28 kilometers on Saturday and 28 kilometers on Sunday. It was easy. Then, on Monday, the temperature went down to minus 56 degrees centigrade. There was white fog in front of their faces. They couldn't see anything. But they travelled 28 kilometers. That night, in their tents, they nearly died of cold. Next day, they stopped and made snow houses. Inside the snow houses, it was warm. But everyone was unhappy. "I told you, Roald," Johansen said. "Even September is too early. We can't travel in this cold. Do you want us to die? Let's go back and wait for better weather." Amundsen was very angry. He was angry with Johansen, but he was angry with himself too. He knew Johansen was right. "All right," he said slowly. "We can go on to the depot at 80 degrees south, leave the food there, and then go back. We can't do more than that." It was 37 kilometers to the depot. The wind was in their faces all day. 2 dogs died on the way. At the depot, they did not stop. They put out the food and the flags, turned round, and went north. At last, the wind was behind them. The dogs ran quickly, and the men sat on the empty sledges. They went faster and faster. It was like a race. Amundsen was on Wisting's sledge, and soon he, Wisting, and Hansen were 3 or 4 kilometers in front. Soon they were alone. They travelled 75 kilometers in 9 hours, and they reached Framheim at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Bjaaland arrived 2 hours later, with 2 more men. But the last 2, Johansen and Prestrud, went more slowly. Their dogs were tired. Their feet were wet and cold. They had no food, and they were alone in the dark. The temperature was minus 51 degrees centigrade. They reached Framheim at midnight. Next morning, Johansen was angry. In front of everyone, he said, "You were wrong, Roald. September was too early. I told you, but you didn't listen. And then you left us alone, and we nearly died in the cold. You're a bad captain. I'm a better captain than you are." Amundsen was very angry. But, at first, he said nothing, because he knew that Johansen was right. Then, that evening, he gave a letter to Johansen. It said, "You aren't coming to the pole with me. When I go south, you can take some dogs and go east to King Edward VII land. You can go with Prestrud and Stubberud. You can be the first men to go there, but not to the South Pole." The Norwegians stayed in Framheim and waited. They lay in bed, listened to the wind outside, and thought about Scott and his motor sledges. Chapter 7. Motor Sledges and Mountains. Scott had 2 motor sledges now. They were the first motor sledges in the Antarctic, the first on Earth. On October 24th, the motor sledges started south from Cape Evans. 4 men went with them, but Scott stayed at Cape Evans for another week. Oates was unhappy. He wrote to his mother, "We had a very bad winter here. I don't like Scott. We were here all winter, but he didn't learn to ski or to drive dogs. Our equipment is bad, and he doesn't think about other people. I'm going to sleep in his tent on the journey, but I don't want to." On November 1st, Scott and Oates and 6 more men left Cape Evans with 8 sledges and 8 ponies. The ponies walked slowly because their feet went down into the snow. It was hard work for them, and they got tired very quickly. They travelled 13 or 14 kilometres in a day. Behind the ponies came Mears with 1 sledge and some dogs. Mears knew how to drive dogs. Every day, Mears started 2 hours after the ponies and arrived 2 hours before them. After 5 days, they found the motor sledges. The Norwegians began again on October 20th. There were 5 men this time: Amundsen, Bjaaland, Wisting, Harsel, and Hansen. They had 4 sledges and 48 dogs. There was a lot of wind and fog. On the first day, Wisting's sledge suddenly stopped, and the back went down. "Come on, you dogs," he said angrily. "Pull! Pull!" At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the sledge moved again. Wisting looked down over the side of the sledge. Under the snow, there was a 50-metre hole. "Did you see that?" Amundsen said. "The ice wants to eat us. Men, dogs, sledges, everything." On the 4th day, they reached the depot at 80 degrees south. There was a bad snowstorm, but they found the flags easily. Next day, the men stayed in their tents, and the dogs played in their holes under the snow. They were all happy. They had a lot of food, they had good equipment, and they were warm. They could travel fast. Next morning, the snowstorm stopped, and the journey began again. Today, everything is wonderful, Bjaaland wrote in his diary. But where is Scott? In front of us or behind? There was no one with the motor sledges. They were broken. Scott looked at them angrily. "It doesn't matter," he said. "Teddy Evans and his men are in front of us. They're good men. They're pulling their sledges themselves. We can get to the pole on foot." Oates looked at Mears. Oates and the ponies were tired, but Mears and his dogs were not. The snow was home for them. That night, Oates wrote, 3 motor sledges at £1,000 each. 19 ponies at £5 each. 32 dogs at £1.50 each. Well, it's not my money, it's Scott's. On November 21st, one of the ponies died. On November 11th, the Norwegians saw the mountains. The mountains were very high, some of the highest on earth. Bjaaland smiled. "There is good skiing up there, Roald," he said. "But can dogs get up there too?" "Of course they can," Amundsen said. "Come on." They left Hansen with the dogs and skied a little way up the mountains. It was difficult, but the mountains were big and beautiful. Behind the mountains, Amundsen thought there was a high plateau of ice. "That's it," Amundsen said. "That's the road to the pole. Tomorrow we can bring the dogs and sledges up here. But now, let's have a ski race. Who can get back to camp first?" They laughed and skied happily down the white snow. "This is like home," Bjaaland thought. "But it's bigger than Norway, and better." In the next 4 days, the dogs pulled the sledges 81 kilometres and went up 3,000 metres. At last, Amundsen and Bjaaland stood on the plateau behind the mountains. They were tired, happy men. Bjaaland looked back at the mountains. "Can a motor sledge get up here?" he asked. Amundsen smiled. "No," he said. "I don't think so. And Scott doesn't like dogs. So his men are going to pull their sledges up these mountains themselves. Would you like to do that, Olaf?" Bjaaland didn't answer. He smiled and skied happily away across the snow.